We're going to talk a little bit about dual language learners, what we know about supporting dual language learners, and some strategies that we can implement in the classroom to support them. So, what we have learned about dual language learners has actually come through extensive research in this area about how children learn a second language. Just to clarify, a dual language learner is a young child who is learning a second language while still developing the basic competency in their first language. So that means that they are fluent in, say, Spanish, but they haven't quite picked up English yet to where they're considered fluent at it. So, what we know is that fluency is actually achieved at a younger age than what we originally thought. So, you may have heard the term critical period before, and that is referring to when the child is most able to learn and understand and make the connections with those languages, or bridging the gap between what their home language is and what the languages that they're trying to acquire. This happens because of characteristics of the developing brain. So, you may remember back when we were talking about music and how children make different connections across the hemispheres with music, and it is a means for helping them to relate different concepts to one another. Well, this is very similar. So essentially, the brain is kind of like a sponge before the age of 3 because they have all of these connections that are firing. And so it's easier for them to make the connections of the home language with the language that they are trying to acquire. After 3 is when we see these connections in different areas starting to kind of close off, and in some areas getting stronger. And so it's a little bit more difficult after the age of 3, or it can take a longer time for them to acquire a language. We also know that the home language is the foundation for them to learn English. So they need to be fluent in understanding their home language before they can make those connections to learn English. So, respect for the family and that home language is kind of a key ingredient for you to be able to establish that transition from home to school and vice versa. I want to identify that there are some differences between how infant toddlers and preschoolers acquire languages. We've already talked about the concepts with the brain connections, but this is going to identify itself in various ways in the classroom. Preschooler might just sit in a possible silent period for a lot longer while they're trying to acquire it, whereas the infant toddlers might progress through it a lot faster because they're more easily and ably to adapt to these different language changes. So, some tips and strategies for how to support dual language learners. First, speak slowly and make good eye contact. Make sure that you're being intentional and choosing your words appropriately. Try to think of when you're explaining something, read their body language. If they're not understanding it one way, slow it down and maybe choose other words that might be able to intentionally communicate a little bit easier to them. Don't use jargon or slang that we tend to use. Try to think of it in more formal terms of talking. Use a lot of visual supports and gestures. Sign language as a supplementary means of communication can be very helpful in the classroom. But picture cards, picture schedules can all help for them to be able to make choices and make the connections as well. You also want to narrate your actions. This will help them acquire the language a little bit faster because you're sharing with them on a more consistent basis of connecting the action with the language that's associated with it. And then you might want to start with some closed-ended questions. That would be a yes or no question. When you ask open-ended questions, which are those who, what, when, where, and how, they're not necessarily going to have the language to articulate themselves and they can become very frustrated. Start with those yes or no questions to help them feel that they can still be independent in the classroom. Picture labels along with the word associated with it can be very helpful. Bring in books that have both languages. Use various writing samples And you can also check out page 185 in your textbook for some additional ideas. There is one in there that I want to elaborate on, and that's posting the key words or phrases in the child's home language. So if you see in the picture the symbol for milk, I believe that's in Chinese. So if you're trying to speak another language and it's not something that you're obviously fluent in, something that can be helpful so that you pronounce it correctly is to spell out the word phonetically. So what I mean by that is if you have no clue how to read this Chinese symbol, but if you can ask the parent to continually say it, or if you can look it up in Google, you can actually find a translator that will actually say the word to you, and then you write it down exactly how it sounds. So the example I like to use for this is fajita. So when we think of fajita and how we typically spell it, it's F-A-J-I-T-A. So the J is actually silent. So the way that I would phonetically spell that to remember how to say it properly might look something like F-A-H-E-E-T-A. Fajita. And that will help you to remember how to pronounce it instead of stumbling across on your words.